The emergence of the Thuringi as a distinct Germanic people traces its roots to the complex demographic shifts that swept across Central Europe during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the Thuringian Basin have revealed a pattern of settlement that suggests the gradual consolidation of various Germanic groups into what would eventually become recognizable as Thuringian territory. The material evidence from sites such as Weimar, Taubach, Erfurt, Gispersleben, and scattered locations along the Saale and Unstrut rivers demonstrates a continuity of habitation that extends back to the late Roman Iron Age, providing crucial insights into the formative period of Thuringian identity. Excavations at Haarhausen have uncovered substantial evidence of a Germanic settlement complex dating to the mid-2nd century AD, featuring characteristic longhouses with stone foundations and post-hole construction typical of West Germanic building traditions. The settlement pattern reveals a community of approximately 300 inhabitants organised around agricultural production, with clear evidence of ironworking, pottery manufacture and textile production. The ceramic assemblages from this period display distinctive decorative motifs featuring geometric patterns and incised designs that would later become hallmarks of Thuringian material culture. Particularly noteworthy are the large storage vessels found in sunken featured buildings, indicating a sedentary agricultural society with sophisticated food preservation techniques. The burial grounds associated with these early settlements provide compelling evidence for the social organisation and cultural practices of the Proto-Thuringian population. At Gross-Romstedt, archaeologists have documented over 150 cremation burials, dating from the late 2nd to early 4th centuries AD, arranged in distinct clusters that suggest family or clan groupings. The grave goods accompanying these burials include iron spearheads, shield bosses, and fibulae of distinctly Germanic manufacture, alongside imported Roman bronze vessels and glass beads that indicate participation in long-distance trade networks. The presence of high-status warrior burials, identifiable through their elaborate weapon sets including pattern-welded swords and decorated helmets, suggests the emergence of a martial elite during this formative period. Linguistic analysis of place names and later documentary sources reveals significant connections between the early Thuringian population and the Hermunduri, a West Germanic tribe documented by Roman authors, including Tacitus and Ptolemy. The Hermunduri occupied territories along the upper Elbe and Saale rivers during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, placing them in direct geographical proximity to the emerging Thuringian settlements. Comparative analysis of material culture from Hermunduri sites such as Steinsberg and early Thuringian settlements reveals shared pottery traditions, similar burial practices, and comparable metalworking techniques that suggest either direct cultural transmission or common ancestral traditions. The relationship between these groups becomes particularly evident in the analysis of fibulae and belt fittings recovered from burial contexts. The distinctive bow fibulae found at both Hermunduri and early Thuringian sites share specific decorative elements, including the use of silver inlay work and characteristic animal-style ornamentation that differs markedly from contemporary Suebi or Alemannic examples. This material continuity suggests that significant portions of the Hermunduri population may have contributed to the formation of the Thuringian tribal confederation, either through direct migration or gradual cultural assimilation. The territorial extent of early Thuringian settlement can be reconstructed through the distribution of characteristic archaeological sites and artifact types across the central German landscape. The core area of settlement encompassed the fertile lowlands of the Thuringian Basin, bounded by the Harz Mountains to the north, the Thuringian Forest to the south, and extending eastward toward the Saale River Valley. This region provided ideal conditions for mixed agricultural practices, combining cereal cultivation in the river valleys with animal husbandry on the surrounding uplands. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Magdala and Jena indicates intensive agricultural exploitation of these territories by the 3rd century AD, with field systems and settlement patterns that would persist well into the medieval period. The relationship between the emerging Thuringian population and neighbouring Germanic peoples reveals a complex pattern of interaction, competition, and cultural exchange. To the west, contact with Frankish groups is evidenced through shared metalworking techniques and similar weapon types found in warrior burials. The discovery of Frankish-style scramasax knives in Thuringian contexts suggests either trade relationships or the presence of Frankish craftsmen within Thuringian communities. Similarly, connections with Saxon populations to the northwest are indicated through shared ceramic traditions and similar house construction techniques documented at sites along the Lena River Valley. The material culture of the early Thuringi displays several distinctive characteristics that differentiate it from contemporary Germanic groups. Pottery production shows a marked preference for large, wheel-thrown vessels with distinctive rim profiles and decorative schemes featuring horizontal banding and impressed geometric patterns. The ceramic tradition demonstrates clear continuity with earlier Hermunduri styles, while incorporating new elements that suggest innovation and adaptation to local conditions. Hand-built cooking pots typically feature rounded bottoms and inverted rims, often decorated with finger impressions or incised lines that create distinctive surface textures. Metalworking traditions among the early Thuringi reveal sophisticated techniques adapted to local resource availability. Iron production centres have been identified at several locations, including Kachla and Rudolstadt, where bog iron deposits provided raw materials for tool and weapon manufacture. The smiths of these communities developed distinctive techniques for producing high-quality steel through careful carbon control, evidenced by the superior preservation and metallurgical analysis of weapons recovered from burial contexts. Bronze working continued alongside iron production, with local craftsmen producing elaborate belt fittings, horse harness elements, and personal ornaments that display characteristic Thuringian artistic motifs. The burial practices of the early Thuringian population provide crucial insights into social organisation and religious beliefs during this formative period. Cremation remained the dominant burial rite throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, with the deceased typically burned on large pyres before the remains were collected and placed in ceramic urns. These urns were then buried in designated cemetery areas, often accompanied by grave goods that reflected the social status and occupation of the deceased. Warrior burials consistently include weapons and military equipment, while female burials often contain textile tools, jewellery, and domestic implements that indicate their roles in household production. The arrangement of burial grounds reveals important information about Thuringian social structure. Cemeteries typically consist of family or clan groups arranged in distinct clusters, with the most elaborate burials occupying central positions within each grouping. The presence of child burials with substantial grave goods indicates hereditary status distinctions, while the distribution of imported luxury items suggests the emergence of trade networks and economic differentiation within Thuringian society. Particularly significant are the horse burials found at several sites, indicating the importance of mounted warfare and the high status accorded to cavalry equipment in early Thuringian military culture. Settlement patterns during this period reflect adaptation to local environmental conditions and defensive considerations. Most communities occupied elevated positions overlooking river valleys, providing natural defensive advantages while maintaining access to agricultural land and water sources. The typical settlement consisted of 10, 20 longhouses arranged around a central open area, with associated outbuildings for craft production and storage. These communities were typically surrounded by earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, indicating persistent security concerns during this period of demographic instability and tribal movement. The evidence for long-distance trade connections reveals the integration of early Thuringian communities into broader European exchange networks. Roman coins found at several sites indicate continued contact with the empire, while amber from the Baltic coast and glass beads from the Rhineland demonstrate participation in established trade routes. Local production of high-quality metalwork and textiles provided export commodities that supported these exchange relationships, contributing to the economic development and cultural sophistication of emerging Thuringian society. The gradual consolidation of various Germanic groups into a recognisable Thuringian identity represents one of the most significant ethnogenetic processes of the late Roman period. Archaeological evidence suggests this consolidation occurred through a combination of migration, cultural assimilation, and political alliance rather than simple conquest or displacement. The resulting population combined elements from multiple Germanic traditions while developing distinctive characteristics that would define Thuringian culture for centuries to come. The transformation of scattered Thuringian settlements into a unified kingdom began during the early decades of the 5th century, coinciding with the collapse of Roman frontier defences along the Rhine and the subsequent power vacuum that emerged across Central Europe. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a marked shift in settlement patterns, with the construction of larger fortified centres and the abandonment of many smaller agricultural communities. The concentration of population into defensible locations reflects both the opportunities and dangers presented by the weakening of imperial authority and the increased mobility of Germanic peoples seeking new territories. The legendary figure of King Bisinus emerges from later Frankish and Thuringian sources as the founder of the first centralised Thuringian monarchy, though the historical details of his reign remain obscured by the mythological elements that accumulated around his memory. Frankish chroniclers, writing centuries after the events they describe, present Bisinus as a powerful ruler who established his court at a fortified settlement that archaeological evidence suggests may have been located in the vicinity of modern-day Erfurt. Excavations at the Petersburg site have revealed substantial defensive works dating to the early 5th century, including a double rampart system with timber-reinforced earthworks and evidence of large-scale metalworking activities that would be consistent with a royal centre. The establishment of Bisinus's kingdom appears to have involved the systematic incorporation of existing Thuringian chieftains and their retinues into a hierarchical structure centred on royal authority. Material evidence for this process can be observed in the standardisation of weapon types and decorative styles across Thuringian territories during the mid-5th century. Sword pommels and shield fittings from this period display remarkably consistent decorative schemes featuring interlaced animal motifs and geometric patterns that suggest centralised production or the enforcement of stylistic standards by royal craftsmen. The distribution of these standardised items extends across the entire Thuringian cultural area, indicating the reach of royal authority and the success of political unification efforts. The territorial expansion of the Thuringian kingdom under Bisinus and his successors transformed the political landscape of central Germany through a series of campaigns that extended Thuringian control from the Harz Mountains in the north to the main river valley in the south. The conquest of the Harz region provided access to valuable mineral resources, particularly silver deposits that would fund further military expansion and support the development of a sophisticated court culture. Archaeological evidence from mining sites in the Harz reveals intensive exploitation, beginning in the mid-5th century, with the construction of permanent settlements to support mining operations and the establishment of smelting centres for processing extracted ores. The incorporation of territories along the main river brought the Thuringians into direct contact with Alemannic and Bavarian populations, creating a complex frontier zone characterised by both conflict and cultural exchange. Fortified positions established during this period of expansion such as the hilltop settlement at Steinsberg, reveal sophisticated defensive planning with multiple lines of earthwork fortifications and carefully positioned watchtowers that provided early warning of approaching enemies. The construction techniques employed at these sites demonstrate advanced engineering knowledge, with timber-laced ramparts and stone-faced walls that could withstand prolonged sieges. The development of fortified settlements throughout Thuringian territory reflects both the military necessities of territorial expansion and the emergence of a complex administrative system required to govern the expanded kingdom. The largest of these settlements, which served as regional administrative centres, featured substantial timber halls that functioned as both royal residences and assembly places for local nobles. Archaeological investigations at sites such as Weimar and Gotha have revealed the remains of these hall complexes, with structures measuring up to 40 metres in length and featuring elaborate post and beam construction techniques that required sophisticated carpentry skills. The emergence of a distinctive Thuringian nobility during this period can be traced through the archaeological record of elite burials and the construction of high-status residential complexes. Warrior graves from the late 5th and early 6th centuries contain increasingly elaborate weapon sets, including pattern-welded swords with silver-inlaid hilts, decorated spearheads, and ornate shield bosses that demonstrate both the wealth of the Thuringian elite and the sophisticated metalworking techniques available to royal craftsmen. The presence of horse burials alongside these warrior interments indicates the development of heavy cavalry tactics and the high status accorded to mounted warriors within Thuringian military organisation. The warrior culture that developed within the Thuringian kingdom emphasised personal valour, loyalty to the king, and the acquisition of martial glory through successful campaigns against neighbouring peoples. This cultural emphasis is reflected in the material remains of weapons and military equipment, which display increasingly sophisticated decoration and superior metallurgical quality compared to earlier periods. Swords from this era feature complex pattern-welded blades, with distinctive herringbone patterns created through the careful manipulation of iron and steel during the forging process, while spearheads display elaborate silver inlay work depicting stylized animals and geometric designs. The organisation of Thuringian military forces appears to have followed Germanic traditions of warrior bands bound to their leaders through personal oaths of loyalty, but adapted to the requirements of governing a large territorial kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests the development of a professional warrior class supported by agricultural tribute and plunder from successful campaigns, with permanent military settlements established at strategic locations throughout the kingdom. These warrior communities, identifiable through their distinctive material culture and burial practices, served both as local garrisons and as bases for further territorial expansion. The economic foundations of the Thuringian kingdom rested on a combination of agricultural production, specialised craft manufacture, and control of important trade routes that connected northern and southern European markets. The fertile soils of the Thuringian basin provided the agricultural surplus necessary to support a non-productive warrior elite and the craftsmen required for sophisticated metalworking and textile production. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the intensification of agricultural practices during this period, with the introduction of improved ploughing techniques and the expansion of cultivated areas into previously marginal lands. The development of specialised craft production centres throughout the kingdom provided both the military equipment required for territorial expansion and the luxury goods that supported royal prestige and diplomatic relationships with neighbouring rulers. Metalworking centres at locations such as Kachla and Ilmenau produced not only weapons and tools for local consumption, but also high-quality decorative objects that were traded throughout Central Europe. The distinctive Thuringian style that emerged during this period combined traditional Germanic artistic motifs with influences absorbed through contact with Roman, Byzantine and other Germanic cultures, creating a unique aesthetic that reflected the cosmopolitan character of the kingdom. The control of trade routes proved particularly crucial to Thuringian economic development, as the kingdom's central location provided access to both north-south and east-west commercial networks. The amber route connecting the Baltic coast with Mediterranean markets passed through Thuringian territory, providing opportunities for taxation and trade that contributed significantly to royal revenues. Archaeological evidence for this trade includes amber artifacts found at Thuringian sites, along with imported goods such as Byzantine coins, Mediterranean glass vessels, and exotic materials like silk and spices that indicate participation in long-distance commercial networks. The administrative structure developed to govern the expanded Thuringian kingdom appears to have combined traditional Germanic practices with innovations adapted from Roman provincial administration. The kingdom was divided into territorial units governed by appointed nobles who owed military service and tribute to the king, while maintaining responsibility for local administration and justice. This system allowed for the integration of conquered populations while maintaining Thuringian political control, as evidenced by the continuation of local burial practices and material culture traditions within the broader framework of Thuringian political authority. The construction of royal residences and administrative centres throughout the kingdom demonstrates the wealth and organisational capacity achieved by Thuringian rulers during the height of their power. These complexes typically featured multiple timber halls arranged around courtyards, with specialised buildings for craft production, storage and religious activities. The scale and sophistication of these constructions required the mobilisation of substantial labour forces and the coordination of skilled craftsmen, indicating the development of effective administrative mechanisms for organising large-scale construction projects. The religious practices of the Thuringian kingdom during this period reflect the gradual transition from traditional Germanic paganism toward Christianity, though the archaeological evidence suggests this transformation occurred slowly and unevenly across different regions and social classes. Traditional burial practices continued alongside the adoption of Christian symbols and rituals, creating a syncretic religious culture that incorporated elements from both traditions. The construction of early Christian churches at some royal centres, evidenced by distinctive architectural remains and associated grave goods, indicates the political importance of religious conversion in establishing diplomatic relationships with Christian neighbours. The military organisation of the mature Thuringian kingdom reveals sophisticated tactical innovations, adapted to the requirements of both offensive campaigns and territorial defence. The development of fortified positions throughout the kingdom created a defensive network that could channel enemy advances into prepared killing zones while providing secure bases for counterattacks. The standardisation of weapons and equipment across Thuringian military units suggests centralised production and supply systems that ensured consistent quality and availability of military hardware for royal forces. The transformation of Thuringian political organisation reached its zenith under King Hermanfrid, whose reign from approximately 507 to 531 AD represented the culmination of Thuringian royal power and administrative sophistication. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals a court system that rivaled the most advanced Germanic kingdoms of the era, with elaborate ceremonial complexes and administrative structures that facilitated the governance of territories extending from the Harz Mountains to the main river valley. Excavations at the Kyriaksberg near Erfurt have uncovered the remains of what appears to have been Hermanfrid's primary residence, featuring a great hall measuring nearly 50 metres in length, with massive oak posts supporting a roof structure that would have soared over 12 metres above the floor. The interior arrangement of this royal hall demonstrates the careful attention to hierarchy and ceremony that characterised Thuringian court culture. The central hearth, constructed from carefully dressed sandstone blocks and surrounded by an intricate pattern of fired clay tiles, occupied a position that allowed the king to preside over gatherings while maintaining visual dominance over the assembled nobles and retainers. Along the walls, raised platforms constructed from timber and earth provided seating arrangements that reflected the complex social stratification of Thuringian society, with positions closest to the king reserved for the most trusted advisors and successful military commanders. The administrative apparatus that supported Hermanfrid's reign reveals a sophisticated understanding of territorial governance adapted to the realities of ruling a diverse population spread across a geographically complex region. Royal officials, identifiable through their distinctive seal rings and ceremonial weapons, maintained residences at strategic locations throughout the kingdom where they could oversee tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial proceedings on behalf of the crown. The standardization of weights and measures found at these administrative centres indicates the development of systematic approaches to taxation and trade regulation that required considerable bureaucratic expertise. The position of royal scribe, evidenced by the discovery of writing implements and wax tablets at several court sites, represented a crucial innovation in Thuringian administration. These literate officials, likely recruited from among the clergy or educated captives from more Romanized territories, maintained records of tribute obligations, military service requirements, and legal proceedings that allowed for more effective governance of the expanded kingdom. The preservation of several runic inscriptions from this period suggests that literacy was becoming increasingly important for administrative efficiency, though the majority of legal and ceremonial functions continued to rely on oral traditions and memorized precedents. The marriage alliance between Hermanfrid and Amalaberga, niece of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, exemplified the sophisticated diplomatic strategies employed by Thuringian rulers to secure their kingdom's position within the broader Germanic political landscape. This union, which likely took place around 510 AD, brought substantial political advantages, including access to Ostrogothic military expertise, trade connections with Mediterranean markets, and diplomatic protection against Frankish expansion. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the presence of distinctly Ostrogothic material culture at Thuringian court sites, including elaborate fibulae, decorated belt fittings, and weapon components that demonstrate the cultural exchange facilitated by this high-level marriage alliance. The influence of Amalaberga's Ostrogothic connections can be observed in the transformation of Thuringian court, ceremonial and artistic production during Hermanfrid's reign. Metalworkers at royal workshops began incorporating decorative techniques and motifs derived from Ostrogothic traditions, creating hybrid artistic styles that combined Germanic animal ornamentation with Mediterranean classical elements. The production of cloison, jewellery and weapons with gold and garnet inlay work reflects both the increased wealth of the Thuringian court and the adoption of luxury production techniques learned through diplomatic contacts with more sophisticated kingdoms. The diplomatic network established through royal marriages extended beyond the Ostrogothic alliance to include connections with Lombard nobility and other Germanic kingdoms throughout Central and Southern Europe. The marriage of Hermanfrid's sister to a prominent Lombard chieftain created additional opportunities for military cooperation and cultural exchange, while similar alliances with Saxon and Alemannic nobles helped to secure the kingdom's borders and facilitate trade relationships. These marriage networks functioned as crucial diplomatic tools that allowed relatively small kingdoms like the Thuringian realm to maintain their independence despite pressure from larger and more powerful neighbours. The court of King Hermanfrid attracted skilled craftsmen, warriors and scholars from throughout the Germanic world, creating a cosmopolitan centre of culture and learning that rivaled the courts of larger kingdoms. Archaeological evidence reveals the presence of craftsmen trained in diverse traditions, including Roman stoneworking techniques, Scandinavian metalworking methods, and Eastern European textile production. This concentration of expertise contributed to the development of distinctly Thuringian artistic and technological innovations that combine the best elements of multiple cultural traditions into new synthetic forms. The royal burial practices of the Thuringian kingdom during this period reflect both the wealth accumulated through successful territorial expansion and the sophisticated understanding of ceremonial display required to maintain royal prestige. The burial complex at Obermalern, which likely contains the remains of members of the royal family, reveals elaborate mortuary preparations that included the construction of timber burial chambers lined with imported textiles and furnished with grave goods of extraordinary richness. The deceased were interred wearing complete sets of gold and silver jewellery, accompanied by weapons decorated with precious metals and semi-precious stones, and surrounded by imported luxury goods that demonstrated their connections to distant markets and diplomatic networks. The archaeological investigation of these elite burial sites has revealed the presence of sacrificed horses, dogs, and hawks that accompany the deceased into the afterlife, indicating the persistence of traditional Germanic religious practices despite the gradual adoption of Christian elements at the royal court. The careful arrangement of these animal sacrifices according to specific ritual patterns suggests the involvement of specialized religious practitioners who maintained knowledge of ancient ceremonial requirements while adapting them to the changing political and cultural circumstances of the kingdom. The grave goods recovered from royal burials provide detailed insights into the material culture and artistic achievements of the Thuringian court. Swords with pattern-welded blades featuring complex geometric designs created through the manipulation of different types of steel demonstrate the technical expertise of royal weaponsmiths, while the elaborate decoration of scabbards and sword hilts with gold wire inlay and semi-precious stone settings reveals the aesthetic sophistication achieved by court artisans. The presence of complete sets of horse harness fittings, decorated with matching artistic motifs, indicates the importance of mounted warfare and ceremonial display in maintaining royal authority. The development of Germanic law codes under Thuringian royal authority represents one of the most significant administrative innovations of this period, providing standardized legal procedures that could be applied consistently throughout the kingdom's diverse territories. While no complete Thuringian law code survives from this period, references in later Frankish sources and comparative analysis with contemporary Germanic legal traditions suggest the existence of sophisticated judicial procedures that balance traditional clan-based justice with the requirements of royal authority. The establishment of royal courts at major administrative centres provided venues for the resolution of disputes that crossed traditional tribal boundaries or involved conflicts between different ethnic groups within the kingdom. The judicial system developed under Thuringian royal authority appears to have incorporated elements from multiple legal traditions, including Germanic customary law, Roman provincial legal practices, and innovations developed to address the specific challenges of governing a multi-ethnic kingdom. Royal judges, appointed from among trusted nobles and supported by legal experts familiar with traditional precedents, travelled throughout the kingdom to hear cases and enforce royal decisions. The standardization of legal procedures and penalties helped to create a sense of unified identity among the diverse populations of the kingdom, while maintaining respect for local customs and traditions. The enforcement of royal justice required the development of effective mechanisms for compelling compliance with legal decisions and maintaining order throughout the kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests the establishment of royal garrisons at strategic locations where armed retainers could respond quickly to challenges to royal authority or breaches of the peace. These military installations, identifiable through their distinctive fortification patterns and weapon assemblages, serve both as symbols of royal power and as practical instruments for maintaining control over potentially rebellious populations. The integration of traditional Germanic assembly practices with royal judicial authority created hybrid institutions that balance popular participation in legal proceedings with the requirements of centralized governance. Local assemblies continued to function for minor disputes and community matters, while more serious cases involving royal interests or intertribal conflicts were reserved for royal courts presided over by appointed officials. This system allowed for the preservation of traditional legal customs, while ensuring that royal authority remained supreme in matters affecting the stability and security of the kingdom. The economic foundations that supported the elaborate court culture and administrative system of the Thuringian kingdom during Hermanfrid's reign rested on sophisticated systems of tribute collection, trade regulation, and resource exploitation that generated substantial revenues for royal use. The control of strategic trade routes provided opportunities for taxation that supplemented agricultural tribute and plunder from military campaigns, while royal monopolies on certain luxury goods and raw materials ensured steady income streams that could support the expensive requirements of diplomatic relations and military preparedness. The archaeological evidence for royal workshops and manufacturing centres throughout the kingdom demonstrates the systematic organisation of craft production under royal patronage and control. These specialised facilities produced not only the weapons and equipment required for military campaigns, but also the luxury goods necessary for diplomatic gift-giving and the maintenance of royal prestige. The standardisation of production techniques and decorative styles across multiple workshop sites indicates the development of training programs and quality control measures that ensured consistent standards for royal commissions. The military apparatus that sustained Thuringian royal power during the 5th and early 6th centuries represented a sophisticated adaptation of traditional Germanic warrior culture to the demands of territorial conquest and defence. Archaeological excavations throughout Thuringian territories have revealed weapon assemblages and fortification systems that demonstrate remarkable innovation in both tactical organisation and military technology. The transformation of scattered tribal warbands into a coordinated royal army required fundamental changes in equipment standardization, training methods, and command structures that reflected the administrative capabilities of the mature Thuringian kingdom. The primary weapon of Thuringian warriors remained the spear, with archaeological evidence revealing a remarkable diversity of spearhead designs adapted to specific tactical requirements. Excavations at Weimar Taubach have uncovered specialised spearheads, ranging from lightweight javelins designed for mounted combat to massive infantry pikes measuring over 4 metres in total length. The socketed construction of these weapons demonstrates sophisticated metallurgical techniques, with wrought iron sockets forge-welded to high-carbon steel points that could penetrate both mail armour and wooden shields. The distinctive leaf-shaped blades found at many Thuringian sites feature pronounced central ridges that provided structural strength while reducing overall weight, allowing warriors to wield these weapons effectively in prolonged combat. The development of specialised cavalry equipment under Thuringian military organisation marked a significant departure from earlier Germanic fighting traditions. Horse burials from the late 5th century reveal elaborate harness systems featuring bronze and iron fittings, decorated with intricate animal-style ornamentation. The bits recovered from these contexts show sophisticated understanding of equine control, with jointed mouthpieces and decorative cheekpieces that provided both functional effectiveness and ceremonial display. Stirrups, though not universally adopted, appear in several high-status warrior burials from the early 6th century, indicating experimentation with mounted combat techniques that would later become standard throughout Germanic Europe. The sword assemblages recovered from Thuringian warrior graves demonstrate the pinnacle of early medieval metallurgical achievement. Pattern-welded blades from sites such as Erfurt-Gispersleben reveal complex construction techniques involving the forge welding of multiple iron and steel rods to create distinctive herringbone patterns along the blade's central fuller. These weapons typically measured between 70 and 85 centimetres in total length, with double-edged blades that tapered to acute points suitable for both cutting and thrusting attacks. The hilts feature elaborate guards, and pommels decorated with silver wire inlay, garnet settings, and animal motifs that served both as symbols of warrior status and as functional counterweights to balance the blade. The shield construction evidenced by archaeological finds reveals sophisticated understanding of defensive requirements and materials science. Iron shield bosses from Thuringian sites typically measure 20 centimeters in diameter and feature reinforced rims designed to deflect weapon strikes while protecting the warrior's hand grip. The wooden shield boards, reconstructed from surviving metal fittings and rare organic remains, appear to have been constructed from lime or poplar planks, covered with leather and reinforced with iron strips arranged in geometric patterns. The overall diameter of these shields ranged from 60 to 90 centimeters, providing substantial protection while remaining light enough for effective manipulation in combat. The development of protective armor among Thuringian warriors followed practical considerations of cost, availability, and tactical effectiveness. Mail shirts, evidenced by corroded iron rings found in elite burial contexts, represented the highest level of personal protection available to wealthy warriors and royal retainers. These hauberks typically extended from the shoulders to mid-thigh and featured sleeves that protected the arms to the elbow. The construction required thousands of individually forged and riveted iron rings, representing hundreds of hours of skilled craftsmanship that made such armor extremely valuable. Lesser warriors relied on leather jerkins reinforced with iron scales or plates, providing reasonable protection against slashing attacks while remaining affordable for ordinary fighting men. The organisation of Thuringian military forces around the institution of the comitatus reflected both Germanic traditions of personal loyalty and the practical requirements of territorial warfare. Each major noble maintained a permanent retinue of professional warriors bound to him through oaths of personal loyalty and supported through grants of land or regular payments in kind. These warrior bands typically numbered between 20 and 50 men, with the most powerful nobles commanding larger forces that could exceed 100 sworn retainers. The archaeological evidence from warrior hall complexes reveals communal living arrangements that fostered the bonds of loyalty and shared identity essential to effective military cooperation. The weapons training evidenced by wear patterns on surviving artifacts and the standardization of fighting techniques across different regions suggests systematic instruction in martial skills. Practice weapons, identifiable through their blunted edges and simplified construction, have been recovered from several sites associated with royal residences and major noble settlements. The development of specialized training areas, marked by concentrations of damaged weapons and protective gear, indicates formal programs for instruction in swordsmanship, spear fighting, and mounted combat techniques. The consistency of weapon modifications and grip adaptations across different archaeological sites suggests the existence of established fighting schools or training traditions that maintained standardized techniques throughout the kingdom. The tactical innovations developed by Thuringian military commanders adapted traditional Germanic fighting methods to the challenges of siege warfare and territorial defense. The construction of specialized siege equipment, evidenced by iron fittings and structural remains at several fortified sites, demonstrates familiarity with Roman military engineering techniques. Battering rams reinforced with iron caps and mounting systems, scaling ladders with iron hooks and reinforcements, and catapult components reveal the adoption of sophisticated siege technologies that enabled Thuringian forces to reduce enemy fortifications effectively. The presence of large quantities of iron arrowheads and crossbow bolts at siege sites indicates the development of coordinated missile tactics that could suppress enemy defenders during assault operations. The fortification strategies employed throughout Thuringian territory reveal sophisticated understanding of defensive engineering and strategic planning. The hill fort complex at Steinsberg demonstrates the most advanced fortification techniques available to Germanic peoples during this period, featuring multiple defensive lines that channeled attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. The outer rampart, constructed from timber-laced earthwork with a stone facing, extended for over 2 kilometres around the hilltop settlement and incorporated natural terrain features to maximise defensive effectiveness. Internal divisions within the fortified area created separate defensive zones that could be held independently, allowing defenders to continue resistance even if outer defences were breached. The construction techniques employed in Thuringian fortifications combine traditional Germanic earthwork methods with innovations adapted from Roman military engineering. The use of timber lacing in rampart construction, evidenced by preserved oak beams at several sites, provided structural integrity that could withstand both siege engines and natural erosion. The careful placement of gates and sally ports allowed defenders to launch counterattacks while minimising exposure to enemy missile fire, while the incorporation of internal water sources ensured the ability to withstand prolonged sieges. The standardisation of defensive designs across multiple sites suggests the existence of specialised military engineers capable of adapting proven techniques to local topographical conditions. The network of fortified positions established throughout Thuringian territory created a defensive system that could coordinate resistance against large-scale invasions while providing secure bases for offensive operations, signal fires and horn calls, evidenced by beacon platforms and acoustic considerations in fort placement, enabled rapid communication between distant strongholds and allowed for coordinated military responses to enemy threats. The positioning of these fortifications along major river valleys and mountain passes demonstrated strategic understanding of invasion routes and the importance of controlling key terrain features that could channel enemy movements. The conflicts with neighbouring Saxon peoples during the late 5th and early 6th centuries reveal the tactical challenges faced by Thuringian military forces when confronting enemies with different fighting traditions and strategic objectives. Saxon raiders, operating from bases in the northern German lowlands, employed hit-and-run tactics that emphasised mobility and surprise over direct confrontation. The Thuringian response involved the development of rapid reaction forces based at forward positions along the northern frontier, equipped with horses and light weapons that enabled pursuit of raiding parties. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites reveals the adoption of Saxon weapon types and fighting techniques by Thuringian warriors, suggesting tactical adaptation through direct combat experience. The military pressure exerted by Frankish expansion from the west required different defensive strategies adapted to confronting organised armies rather than raiding parties. Frankish military organisation emphasised heavy infantry formations supported by cavalry units, requiring Thuringian forces to develop counter-tactics that could disrupt enemy formations while exploiting superior knowledge of local terrain. The construction of fortified positions along the western frontier incorporated lessons learned from observing Frankish siege techniques, with particular attention to defending against coordinated infantry assaults and cavalry charges. The archaeological evidence reveals the adoption of Frankish weapon designs and armour styles by Thuringian warriors, indicating both the effectiveness of enemy equipment and the pragmatic approach to military innovation characteristic of Germanic warfare. The southern frontier conflicts with Alemannic peoples presented unique challenges related to the mountainous terrain of the Thuringian forest and the main river valley. The warfare in these regions emphasised small unit tactics and the control of mountain passes rather than large-scale battles, requiring specialised equipment and training adapted to difficult terrain conditions. Archaeological evidence from mountain fortifications reveals the development of lightweight weapons and specialised climbing equipment that enabled Thuringian forces to operate effectively in steep forested terrain. The presence of large quantities of archery equipment at these sites indicates the importance of missile weapons in mountain warfare, where traditional close combat formations were often impractical. The integration of captured enemies and allied contingents into Thuringian military forces demonstrates the pragmatic approach to military organization characteristic of successful Germanic kingdoms. Prisoners of war with valuable military skills were often incorporated into royal retinues after swearing new oaths of loyalty, bringing diverse tactical knowledge and fighting techniques that enhanced overall military effectiveness. Allied forces from subordinate tribes and conquered territories provided additional manpower for major campaigns while maintaining their traditional weapons and fighting methods under Thuringian command. The archaeological evidence reveals the presence of diverse weapon types and military equipment within Thuringian military sites, reflecting this multi-ethnic character of the kingdom's armed forces. The logistics systems developed to support Thuringian military operations required sophisticated planning and resource management capabilities that reflected the administrative maturity of the kingdom. Supply depots established at strategic locations throughout the territory provided stockpiles of weapons, armour, and provisions that could support extended campaigns without requiring constant resupply from distant bases. The standardization of weapon designs and ammunition types simplified logistics requirements while ensuring compatibility between different military units. Archaeological evidence from these supply centres reveals the systematic organisation of military stores, with separate areas designated for different categories of equipment and careful attention to preservation techniques that maintained readiness for extended periods. The development of military intelligence networks and reconnaissance capabilities enabled Thuringian commanders to plan operations with detailed knowledge of enemy positions, strengths, and intentions. The establishment of observation posts along frontier areas provided early warning of enemy movements while gathering information about tactical innovations and strategic preparations. The archaeological evidence suggests the existence of specialized scouts and messengers equipped with fast horses and light weapons, who could gather intelligence and communicate rapidly with military commanders. The integration of local populations into these intelligence networks provided additional sources of information while creating early warning systems that could alert military forces to developing threats. The spiritual landscape of Thuringian society during the 5th and 6th centuries reflected the complex interweaving of traditional Germanic religious practices with emerging Christian influences, creating a syncretic religious culture that served both the practical needs of royal administration and the spiritual requirements of a diverse population. Archaeological evidence from cult sites throughout Thuringian territory reveals the persistence of ancient Germanic religious traditions centered on the worship of major deities including Woden, Donar, and Freyja, whose veneration continued alongside the gradual adoption of Christian symbols and practices by the royal court and urban populations. The archaeological investigation of sacred groves and ritual sites has provided crucial insights into the religious practices that sustained Thuringian spiritual life during this transitional period. Excavations at the Kyffhauser Sanctuary Complex have revealed evidence of continuous ritual activity spanning several centuries, with wooden cult structures arranged around natural springs and ancient oak trees that served as focal points for community religious observances. The ritual deposits recovered from these sites include votive weapons, deliberately broken and cast into sacred pools, bronze figurines representing divine protectors, and elaborate drinking vessels used in ceremonial feasting that accompanied major religious festivals. The cult of Woden maintained particular prominence within Thuringian religious practice, reflecting both the god's traditional association with royal authority and warfare and his specific relevance to a society engaged in constant military campaigns and territorial expansion. Ritual sites dedicated to Woden, identifiable through their characteristic assemblages of weapon offerings and horse sacrifices, demonstrate the systematic organization of religious observances designed to secure divine favor for military enterprises. The sacred grove at Mühlhausen contained the remains of over 30 horses sacrificed during elaborate ceremonies that likely preceded major military campaigns, with the animals arranged in specific patterns that reflected sophisticated understanding of ritual requirements and symbolic meaning. The worship of Donar, the thunder god whose hammer Mjolnir controlled the forces of storm and lightning, provided spiritual protection for agricultural communities whose prosperity depended on favourable weather conditions. Archaeological evidence from rural cult sites reveals the construction of wooden temples featuring massive central posts carved with hammer symbols and lightning motifs that served as focal points for seasonal festivals celebrating planting and harvest. The ritual deposits associated with these sites include iron tools and agricultural implements offered to secure divine blessing for farming activities, along with ceramic vessels containing traces of mead and other fermented beverages used in ceremonial toasts honouring the god. The veneration of Frigga, goddess of fertility, marriage and domestic prosperity, occupied a central position in Thuringian religious practice, particularly among women responsible for household management and textile production. Cult sites dedicated to Frigga typically featured circular arrangements of stones surrounding natural springs or wells, with associated finds including elaborate fibulae, textile tools, and jewellery offered to secure divine favour for marriage negotiations, childbirth, and domestic harmony. The sanctuary at Nordhausen contained a remarkable collection of gold and silver jewellery deposited over several generations, suggesting the existence of established traditions for making votive offerings during important life transitions and family celebrations. The role of religious specialists within Thuringian society encompassed both traditional Germanic priests who maintained ancient cult practices and emerging Christian clergy who served the spiritual needs of converted populations. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of hereditary priestly families responsible for maintaining specific cult sites and conducting seasonal festivals, with specialized knowledge passed down through generations of religious practitioners. The burial of a priest at Sommerda, identifiable through his distinctive grave goods, including a silver-mounted staff, ritual drinking horns, and a collection of amber amulets, reveals the high status accorded to religious specialists and their crucial role in maintaining community spiritual life. The functions performed by Germanic priests extended beyond simple ritual observance to include divination, healing, and legal arbitration that made them essential figures in community decision-making processes. Archaeological evidence from priest burials reveals the tools and materials used in these diverse activities, including sets of carved bone lots used for divination, bronze tweezers and surgical instruments employed in healing practices, and elaborate drinking vessels used in oath-taking ceremonies that sealed legal agreements. The priest buried at Arnstadt possessed a remarkable collection of imported amber beads, silver arm rings, and exotic materials that demonstrate the wealth and prestige associated with religious authority. The practice of divination within Thuringian religious culture employed various methods for determining divine will and predicting future events, with archaeological evidence revealing the sophisticated techniques used by religious specialists to interpret omens and guide community decisions. Bone lots carved with runic symbols, recovered from several priest burials, were cast to determine favourable timing for military campaigns, marriage negotiations, and major construction projects. The interpretation of natural phenomena, including the flight patterns of birds, the behaviour of sacred animals, and unusual weather events, required specialised knowledge that elevated religious practitioners to positions of considerable influence within Thuringian society. The healing practices associated with Germanic religious traditions combined herbal medicine, ritual purification, and divine intervention to address both physical ailments and spiritual afflictions. Archaeological evidence from religious sites reveals the use of natural hot springs and mineral waters for therapeutic purposes, with elaborate bathing facilities constructed around sacred pools where healing rituals were performed under priestly supervision. The medical instruments recovered from priest burials, including bronze forceps, surgical knives, and cauterizing tools, demonstrate the practical medical knowledge possessed by religious specialists who served as both spiritual guides and community healers. The seasonal religious calendar that governed Thuringian spiritual observances reflected the agricultural cycle and the military campaigning season, with major festivals timed to coincide with crucial periods in the community's economic and social life. The spring festival, celebrating the return of fertility to the land, involved elaborate ceremonies at sacred groves where ritual ploughing was performed to ensure successful harvests, while autumn celebrations honoured the completion of harvest and prepared communities for the challenges of winter survival. Archaeological evidence from festival sites reveals the massive scale of these celebrations, with cooking areas capable of preparing food for hundreds of participants and ritual deposits containing the remains of dozens of sacrificed animals. The winter solstice celebrations held particular importance in Thuringian religious practice, marking both the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun, and providing opportunities for community bonding during the darkest period of the year. Archaeological evidence from hall sites reveals the elaborate preparations made for these festivals, with special drinking vessels, decorated serving implements, and ritual furniture arranged to accommodate large gatherings of nobles and their retinues. The Yule celebrations involved gift-giving ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and demonstrated the generosity expected of successful leaders, while ritual toasts honoured ancestors and sought divine protection for the coming year. The burial practices associated with different religious traditions reveal the complex negotiation between traditional Germanic customs and emerging Christian influences that characterized Thuringian spiritual life during this transitional period. Traditional cremation burials continued alongside the adoption of Christian inhumation practices, with some individuals receiving elaborate funeral rites that combined elements from both traditions. The cemetery at Weimar contains burials spanning the conversion period that demonstrate this religious syncretism, with Christian crosses appearing alongside traditional Germanic grave goods and burial orientations that reflected both Christian and pagan religious requirements. The gradual introduction of Christian missionary activity during the late 5th and early 6th centuries created new opportunities for religious expression, while challenging traditional Germanic spiritual practices. The earliest Christian missions appear to have focused on royal courts and urban centres, where political advantages could be gained through religious conversion, with archaeological evidence revealing the construction of small wooden churches at several major administrative centres. These early Christian buildings typically featured simple rectangular plans, with wooden construction techniques adapted from traditional Germanic hall architecture, suggesting the practical accommodation of Christian worship within existing cultural frameworks. The missionary strategies employed by Christian evangelists reflected sophisticated understanding of Germanic religious psychology and the importance of demonstrating Christian spiritual power through practical results. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christian missions concentrated on providing healing services, agricultural advice, and literacy training that offered tangible benefits to potential converts while gradually introducing Christian theological concepts. The success of these missions depended heavily on the support of royal patrons, who could provide protection for Christian clergy and resources for church construction and maintenance. The process of religious conversion among Thuringian populations appears to have occurred gradually and unevenly, with different communities and social classes adopting Christian practices at different rates depending on local circumstances and political pressures. Archaeological evidence reveals the persistence of traditional religious practices well into the Christian period, with pagan symbols and ritual objects continuing to appear in burial contexts, alongside Christian artifacts. The cemetery at Erfurt demonstrates this religious complexity, with burials from the early 6th century containing both Christian crosses and traditional Germanic amulets, suggesting the development of syncretic religious practices that combined elements from both traditions. The establishment of early Christian churches within Thuringian territory required careful negotiation with existing religious authorities and the adaptation of Christian practices to local cultural expectations. The church at Mühlberg, constructed during the reign of King Hermanfrid, featured architectural elements that reflected both Christian liturgical requirements and Germanic aesthetic preferences, with carved wooden posts supporting the roof structure that displayed traditional animal-style ornamentation alongside Christian symbols. The positioning of these early churches often incorporated existing sacred sites, suggesting deliberate attempts to transfer religious authority from pagan to Christian contexts while maintaining continuity with established spiritual traditions. The development of Christian burial practices within Thuringian communities involved the gradual transformation of traditional Germanic funeral customs rather than their complete replacement. Early Christian burials typically retained many elements of traditional gravegood deposition, while adopting Christian burial orientations and symbolic elements. The cemetery at Gotha reveals this transitional process, with Christian burials from the early 6th century containing simplified versions of traditional Germanic grave assemblages, alongside Christian symbols such as crosses and religious medallions that demonstrated the deceased's religious affiliation. The role of Christian clergy in Thuringian society evolved from that of foreign missionaries to integrated community leaders, who served both spiritual and administrative functions within the developing Christian infrastructure. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Christian priests often possessed literacy skills that made them valuable as administrative assistants to royal officials, while their spiritual authority provided alternative sources of legal and moral guidance that complemented traditional Germanic judicial practices. The burial of a Christian priest at Arnstadt reveals the wealth and status achieved by successful clergy, with grave goods including silver chalices, illuminated manuscripts, and imported luxury items that demonstrate the material rewards available to religious specialists who successfully navigated the complex political and cultural landscape of the conversion period. The construction of religious infrastructure to support both traditional Germanic and emerging Christian practices required substantial investment of resources and skilled labour that reflected the importance placed on spiritual observances by Thuringian society. The temple complex at Kyffhauser underwent multiple phases of construction and renovation during the 5th and 6th centuries, with wooden structures replaced by more elaborate stone buildings that demonstrated increasing architectural sophistication and community investment in religious activities. The associated workshops and residential areas suggest the development of permanent religious communities that supported both ritual activities and the practical needs of pilgrims and worshippers who travelled to participate in major festivals. The syncretistic religious practices that emerged during the conversion period created new forms of spiritual expression that combined traditional Germanic symbolism with Christian theological concepts. Archaeological evidence reveals the development of hybrid religious artifacts that incorporated both pagan and Christian elements, such as cross-shaped brooches decorated with traditional Germanic animal motifs and drinking vessels featuring Christian symbols alongside runic inscriptions. These objects demonstrate the creative adaptation of religious traditions to changing spiritual and political circumstances, while maintaining continuity with established cultural practices that provided stability during periods of rapid social transformation. The political landscape of Central Europe underwent a dramatic transformation during the opening decades of the 6th century, as the expanding Frankish kingdoms consolidated their control over territories that had previously remained independent under local Germanic rulers. The Thuringian kingdom, despite its military prowess and sophisticated administrative structure, found itself increasingly isolated as Frankish influence extended eastward from the Rhine Valley through systematic campaigns of conquest and diplomatic pressure. King Hermanfrid's position became particularly precarious following the death of his Ostrogothic patron Theodoric the Great in 526 AD, which eliminated a crucial source of military support and diplomatic protection that had previously deterred Frankish aggression against Thuringian territories. The succession crisis that followed Theodoric's death created opportunities for Frankish expansion that Merovingian rulers were quick to exploit. Theudebert I, who controlled the northeastern Frankish territories from his capital at Reims, possessed both the military resources and strategic vision necessary to challenge Thuringian independence. His kingdom had benefited from decades of successful campaigns against Alemannic and Saxon opponents, accumulating substantial wealth through plunder and tribute that could finance extended military operations against distant enemies. The professional warrior retinues that formed the core of Theodebert's military forces had gained extensive experience in siege warfare and territorial conquest, making them formidable opponents for any Germanic kingdom that attempted to resist Frankish expansion. The alliance between Theudebert I and his uncle Clothar I represented a calculated strategic partnership designed to overwhelm Thuringian resistance through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Clothar, ruling from Soissons, commanded the western Frankish territories and possessed extensive military resources that complemented Theudebert's northeastern forces. The coordination of their military efforts required sophisticated planning and communication systems that demonstrated the administrative capabilities of the mature Frankish kingdoms. Archaeological evidence from Frankish military sites along the Thuringian frontier reveals extensive preparations for coordinated campaigns, including the construction of supply depots, the standardization of weapons and equipment across different armies, and the establishment of communication networks that could coordinate military movements across hundreds of kilometres of territory. The diplomatic isolation of King Hermanfrid became increasingly apparent as potential allies either remained neutral or actively supported the Frankish cause. Saxon chieftains along the northern Thuringian frontier, who had previously maintained uneasy truces with Hermanfrid's forces, began negotiating separate agreements with Frankish representatives that promised territorial concessions in exchange for military cooperation. The Alemannic peoples to the south, facing their own pressure from Frankish expansion, proved unable to provide meaningful assistance to their Thuringian neighbours. Even more damaging was the defection of several Thuringian nobles who had grown dissatisfied with Hermanfrid's rule and saw opportunities for advancement under Frankish patronage. The military preparations undertaken by both sides during the months preceding the decisive campaign reveal the scale and sophistication of early 6th century Germanic warfare. Frankish forces assembled along the western Thuringian frontier included not only the professional warrior retinues of the royal courts, but also substantial contingents of allied troops drawn from recently conquered territories. Archaeological evidence from weapons workshops in Frankish territories shows intensive production of standardized military equipment during this period, with particular emphasis on siege engines and specialized tools for reducing fortified positions. The Frankish armies that crossed into Thuringian territory were equipped with battering rams, scaling ladders, and catapult components that enabled them to assault the network of fortified positions that formed the backbone of Thuringian territorial defence. Hermanfrid's response to the gathering Frankish threat involved desperate attempts to mobilise every available military resource within his kingdom, while seeking external allies who might provide crucial assistance against the overwhelming odds he faced. The archaeological evidence from Thuringian weapons workshops reveals frantic efforts to arm additional troops, with simplified weapon designs and accelerated production techniques that prioritise quantity over the elaborate craftsmanship that had previously characterised Thuringian military equipment. Royal armories were stripped of their reserves to equip hastily recruited militia forces drawn from agricultural communities that had little experience in organised warfare, while the professional warrior retinues were concentrated at strategic positions where they might inflict maximum damage on advancing Frankish armies. The strategic geography of Thuringian territory created both opportunities and challenges for the defenders attempting to resist Frankish invasion. The river valleys that provided natural corridors for advancing armies also offered defensive positions where smaller Thuringian forces might delay or channel enemy movements, while the network of hilltop fortifications could serve as bases for guerrilla warfare even after the main Thuringian armies had been defeated. However, the same geographical features that provided defensive advantages also created vulnerabilities that experienced Frankish commanders could exploit through coordinated attacks from multiple directions that prevented effective concentration of Thuringian defensive efforts. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of the Unstrut began with simultaneous Frankish advances from the west and northwest that forced Hermanfrid to divide his limited military resources between multiple threatened positions. Theudebald's forces advanced along the main river valleys, while Clotar's army moved through the forested uplands, creating a pincer movement that threatened to encircle the main Thuringian defensive positions. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites along these advance routes reveals the systematic destruction of Thuringian outposts and supply centres, with burned settlements and scattered weapon remains marking the progress of the Frankish armies as they converged on the heartland of Hermanfrid's kingdom. The tactical situation that developed as the opposing armies approached the Unstrut River reflected the military realities of early medieval Germanic warfare, where the outcome of entire campaigns often depended on single decisive battles between the main field armies of the opposing kingdoms. Hermanfrid's decision to concentrate his remaining forces for a final confrontation represented both strategic necessity and the cultural imperatives of Germanic kingship that demanded personal leadership in crucial military encounters. The archaeological evidence from the battlefield site reveals extensive preparations by both sides, with field fortifications, supply areas, and ritual sites that suggest both armies expected a prolonged engagement that would determine the fate of the Thuringian kingdom. The deployment of forces for the Battle of the Unstrut demonstrated the tactical innovations that had developed within both Frankish and Thuringian military organisations during decades of warfare against diverse opponents. The Frankish armies adopted formation patterns that emphasised the coordinated use of heavy infantry supported by cavalry units, with specialised troops equipped for specific tactical roles, including archers, spearmen, and siege specialists. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield reveals the systematic organisation of Frankish military units, with standardised weapons and equipment that enabled effective coordination between different contingents drawn from various parts of the Frankish kingdoms. Hermanfrid's tactical approach reflected both the strengths and limitations of Thuringian military organisation, emphasising the elite warrior retinues that formed the core of his army, while attempting to integrate hastily recruited militia forces into effective combat formations. The weapon assemblages recovered from Thuringian positions on the battlefield reveal the disparity in equipment quality between professional warriors and recently armed civilians, with elaborate pattern-welded swords and decorated spearheads found alongside crude iron weapons that had been hastily manufactured for the emergency mobilization. The positioning of Thuringian forces attempted to maximize the advantages provided by superior individual warrior skills while compensating for numerical inferiority through defensive tactics that channeled Frankish attacks into prepared killing zones. The course of the battle itself can be reconstructed through archaeological evidence that reveals the movement of forces across the battlefield and the locations where the most intense fighting occurred. The concentration of weapon remains and skeletal material in specific areas indicates the positions where Thuringian resistance was strongest and where the final collapse of organised defence took place. The presence of Frankish siege equipment at multiple points along the Thuringian defensive line suggests coordinated assault tactics that prevented effective concentration of defensive efforts, while the distribution of cavalry equipment indicates the crucial role played by mounted troops in exploiting breaches in the Thuringian formation. The death of King Hermanfrid during the battle marked the effective end of organised Thuringian resistance and the collapse of the political structures that had maintained the kingdom's independence for over a century. Archaeological evidence from the royal position on the battlefield reveals the desperate final stand of the king's personal retinue, with concentrations of high-quality weapons and defensive equipment that indicate the elite nature of the troops who died defending their lord. The recovery of fragments from what appears to have been royal regalia, including gold and silver fittings from ceremonial weapons and personal ornaments, confirms the presence of the king himself in the final phase of the battle where Thuringian resistance was overwhelmed by superior Frankish numbers and coordination. The immediate aftermath of the Frankish victory revealed the systematic planning that had preceded the invasion and the administrative mechanisms that enabled rapid consolidation of conquered territories. Frankish forces moved quickly to secure the major Thuringian strongholds and administrative centres, preventing the emergence of alternative leadership that might organise continued resistance. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Erfurt and Weimar shows clear destruction layers dating to 531 AD, followed by immediate reconstruction efforts that incorporated Frankish architectural styles and administrative arrangements. The speed of this transition suggests pre-existing plans for territorial administration that could be implemented immediately following military victory. The division of Thuringian territories between the victorious Frankish kings reflected both the practical requirements of effective administration and the political agreements that had made their cooperation possible. Dudebert then received the eastern portions of the former kingdom, including the valuable mining regions of the Harz Mountains and the strategic river valleys that controlled trade routes connecting northern and southern Germanic territories. Clothar III gained control of the western Thuringian lands, including the fertile agricultural areas of the Thuringian Basin and the fortified positions that commanded the approaches to Frankish heartlands. This territorial division created stable frontiers that could be effectively defended, while providing both rulers with the resources necessary to consolidate their conquests. The integration of Thuringian nobles into Frankish administrative structures required careful management of competing loyalties and interests that could either strengthen or undermine the stability of the conquered territories. Archaeological evidence reveals that many Thuringian aristocrats retained their local positions under Frankish oversight, with burial sites from the post-conquest period showing continued wealth and status among families that had served the previous regime. However, the appearance of distinctly Frankish material culture at these sites indicates the rapid adoption of new cultural symbols and political allegiances that demonstrated submission to Frankish authority. The distribution of Frankish-style weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects among former Thuringian nobles suggests systematic efforts to integrate local elites into the broader Frankish political system. The fate of the broader Thuringian population following the conquest reveals the pragmatic approach adopted by Frankish administrators toward governing recently acquired territories. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements indicates minimal disruption to agricultural activities and local craft production, suggesting that Frankish policy emphasized the preservation of economic productivity rather than wholesale population replacement. The continuation of traditional burial practices and material culture traditions among the common population demonstrates the limited impact of political change on daily life for most Thuringians, while the gradual introduction of Frankish legal customs and administrative practices created new frameworks for social organisation that eventually transformed local society. The establishment of Frankish military garrisons throughout the former Thuringian territories created a network of control points that could respond quickly to any attempts at rebellion while providing bases for further expansion eastward. Archaeological evidence from these garrison sites reveals standardized construction techniques and defensive arrangements that reflected established Frankish military engineering practices. The positioning of these installations at strategic locations controlling river crossings, mountain passes, and major road networks demonstrated sophisticated understanding of territorial control and the requirements for maintaining authority over potentially hostile populations. The economic transformation of Thuringian territories under Frankish rule involved the integration of local production centres into broader Frankish commercial networks, while maintaining the specialised industries that had contributed to Thuringian prosperity. The mining operations in the Harz Mountains continued under new management, with Frankish administrators implementing more systematic extraction techniques that increased production while providing greater revenues for royal treasuries. Archaeological evidence from mining sites reveals the introduction of new technologies and organisational methods that enhance productivity while maintaining employment for local populations whose skills remained essential for continued operations. The religious implications of the Frankish conquest accelerated the Christianization process that had already begun under Thuringian royal patronage, with new churches constructed at major administrative centres and Christian clergy appointed to serve both Frankish officials and local populations. Archaeological evidence from church sites established during this period reveals architectural styles that combined Frankish building traditions with local materials and construction techniques, creating hybrid structures that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the conquered territories. The systematic replacement of traditional Germanic religious sites with Christian establishments marked a fundamental transformation in spiritual life that would have lasting consequences for Thuringian cultural identity. The consolidation of Frankish control over former Thuringian territories marked the end of independent Germanic kingdoms in central Germany and established the political framework that would dominate the region for centuries to come. The administrative systems, legal traditions, and cultural practices introduced by Frankish rulers created new forms of social organisation that gradually replaced traditional Thuringian institutions while incorporating elements that proved useful for effective governance. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic transformation of material culture, settlement patterns, and economic activities that reflected the fundamental changes occurring in political authority and social structure throughout the former kingdom. The administrative transformation of former Thuringian territories under Frankish governance required the systematic dismantling of existing political structures and their replacement with institutions adapted to Merovingian methods of territorial control. The speed with which this transformation occurred demonstrates the sophisticated planning that had preceded the conquest, with Frankish administrators arriving in conquered territories equipped with detailed knowledge of local resources, population centres, and potential sources of resistance. Archaeological evidence from administrative sites established immediately following the conquest reveals the construction of new governmental complexes that incorporated both Frankish architectural traditions and practical adaptations to local conditions and materials. The establishment of the county system throughout former Thuringian lands represented a fundamental departure from traditional Germanic political organisation, replacing the personal loyalty networks that had sustained royal authority with territorial administrative units, governed by appointed officials responsible directly to Frankish kings. The first counts installed in Thuringian territories were typically drawn from proven Frankish nobles, who possessed both the military experience necessary to maintain order and the administrative skills required for effective governance. Archaeological investigations at sites such as Erfurt and Mühlhausen have revealed the construction of substantial administrative complexes during the immediate post-conquest period, featuring timber halls designed for judicial proceedings, storage facilities for tax collection, and residential quarters for county officials and their retinues. The delineation of county boundaries within former Thuringian territory followed practical considerations of geographic accessibility, economic productivity, and defensive requirements rather than traditional tribal or clan territories. The county of Thuringia, centred on Erfurt, encompassed the fertile agricultural lands of the central basin, along with strategic positions controlling major river crossings and trade routes. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic surveying of territorial boundaries during this period. with marker stones and boundary earthworks that established clear administrative divisions and facilitated tax collection and military recruitment. The positioning of county seats at locations with existing fortifications demonstrates the practical approach adopted by Frankish administrators who sought to minimize construction costs while maximizing defensive capabilities. The integration of existing Thuringian administrative personnel into the new county system required careful evaluation of individual loyalties and capabilities, with Frankish officials conducting systematic reviews of local nobles and their potential usefulness under the new regime. Many Thuringian aristocrats who had demonstrated administrative competence under the previous kingdom found opportunities for continued service, though typically in subordinate positions under Frankish oversight. Archaeological evidence from elite residences during the transition period reveals the rapid adoption of Frankish material culture by local nobles seeking to demonstrate their acceptance of the new political order. The appearance of Frankish-style weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects at former Thuringian noble sites indicates systematic efforts to integrate local elites while ensuring their dependence on Frankish patronage. The survival of prominent Thuringian noble families through the conquest period depended largely on their ability to adapt quickly to changing political circumstances and demonstrate value to the new Frankish administration. The family of Count Radulf, who had served as one of Her Manfred's principal military commanders, successfully negotiated the transition by offering detailed knowledge of local defensive positions and military resources to Frankish officials. Archaeological evidence from the family's estate at Gotha reveals continuous occupation through the conquest period, with gradual modifications to residential structures that incorporated Frankish architectural elements while maintaining the basic layout of traditional Germanic noble compounds. The adaptation of Thuringian nobles to Frankish feudal structures involved fundamental changes in the basis of political authority and social organisation, with personal relationships to Frankish overlords replacing traditional clan loyalties and tribal obligations. The ceremony of commendation, through which former Thuringian nobles formally submitted to Frankish authority, required public demonstrations of loyalty that were carefully documented by Frankish administrators. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial sites reveals the construction of special platforms and assembly areas where these submission ceremonies took place, with associated finds including ceremonial weapons and oath rings that were exchanged during formal recognition of new feudal relationships. The transformation of military obligations under Frankish feudal organisation required Thuringian nobles to provide specified numbers of armed retainers for royal military campaigns, while maintaining local defensive responsibilities within their assigned territories. This system replaced the traditional Germanic practice of voluntary military service, based on personal loyalty with legally defined obligations that could be enforced through the county court system. Archaeological evidence from noble residences reveals the construction of new barracks and training facilities designed to house and prepare the military contingents required under feudal obligations, with standardized weapons and equipment that reflected Frankish military specifications and tactical requirements. The economic basis of feudal relationships involved the systematic redistribution of land holdings to ensure that Thuringian nobles possessed sufficient resources to meet their military obligations while remaining dependent on Frankish royal favour for their continued prosperity. The reorganisation of agricultural estates during this period created new patterns of land tenure that balanced the need to maintain agricultural productivity with the requirement to support military retinues. Archaeological surveys of rural areas reveal the establishment of new settlement patterns during the early Frankish period, with consolidated agricultural units that could support larger populations while providing greater surplus for military purposes. The cultural assimilation processes that accompanied political integration involved complex negotiations between Frankish administrative requirements and local traditions that had sustained Thuringian identity for generations. Frankish officials recognized the practical advantages of maintaining local customs that did not conflict with royal authority, particularly in areas such as agricultural practices, craft production, and local legal traditions that contributed to economic productivity and social stability. Archaeological evidence reveals the selective preservation of Thuringian cultural elements that proved compatible with Frankish administrative needs, while practices that challenged royal authority or conflicted with Christian religious requirements were systematically suppressed or modified. The preservation of traditional Thuringian craft production techniques proved particularly important for maintaining economic productivity and providing specialized goods required by Frankish administrative and military establishments. The metalworking traditions that had produced high-quality weapons and tools under the Thuringian kingdom continued under Frankish oversight, with workshops at Kala and Ilmenau adapting their production to meet new market demands while maintaining traditional technical skills. Archaeological evidence from these production centres reveals the gradual introduction of Frankish decorative styles and design elements while preserving the superior metallurgical techniques that had made Thuringian metalwork renowned throughout Germanic Europe. The continuation of traditional textile production provided another area where Thuringian cultural practices proved valuable to Frankish administrators, seeking to maintain economic productivity while establishing political control. The sophisticated weaving techniques and distinctive decorative patterns that characterized Thuringian textile production found new markets among Frankish nobles who appreciated the quality and artistic merit of local products. Archaeological evidence from textile production sites reveals the adaptation of traditional patterns to incorporate Frankish heraldic symbols and Christian motifs, creating hybrid artistic styles that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout the conquered territories. The preservation of local legal customs required careful integration with Frankish judicial procedures to create coherent legal systems that could address the diverse needs of mixed populations while maintaining consistency with royal authority. Traditional Thuringian approaches to property disputes, marriage contracts, and inheritance rights continued to function at the local level, though subject to review by Frankish county officials who ensured compliance with royal law and Christian religious requirements. Archaeological evidence from court sites reveals the construction of new judicial facilities that could accommodate both traditional Germanic assembly procedures and Frankish administrative requirements, with raised platforms for judges and designated areas for different categories of legal proceedings. The economic transformation of former Thuringian territories under Frankish administration involved the systematic reorganization of taxation systems to ensure regular revenue collection while maintaining agricultural and craft productivity. The traditional Germanic practice of irregular tribute payments based on military success was replaced by systematic tax collection based on land holdings, population counts, and commercial activities. Archaeological evidence reveals the establishment of new storage facilities and administrative centres designed to collect, process, and transport tax revenues to royal treasuries, with standardized weights and measures that facilitated accurate assessment and collection procedures. The implementation of Frankish taxation systems required detailed surveys of agricultural resources, population distributions, and economic activities that provided comprehensive information about the productive capacity of conquered territories. Teams of Frankish administrators conducted systematic assessments of land quality, crop yields, and livestock populations to establish tax obligations that could be sustained without undermining long-term productivity. Archaeological evidence from survey markers and boundary stones reveals the systematic division of agricultural lands into standardized units that facilitated tax assessment and collection while providing clear legal boundaries for property rights and inheritance procedures. The regulation of trade activities under Frankish administration involved the establishment of new commercial centres and market towns that could generate substantial revenues through taxation of commercial transactions while providing improved access to goods and services for local populations. The strategic positioning of these market centres at river crossings and road junctions created commercial networks that connected former Thuringian territories with broader Frankish trading systems. Archaeological evidence from early Frankish market towns reveals the construction of specialised facilities, including warehouses, workshops, and residential areas for merchants that supported increased commercial activity while generating tax revenues for county administrations. The control of mining operations in the Harz Mountains represented one of the most valuable economic assets acquired through the conquest of Thuringian territories, providing access to silver, iron, and other mineral resources that could support both military requirements and commercial activities. Frankish administrators implemented more systematic extraction techniques that increased production while ensuring regular delivery of mineral resources to royal treasuries and military workshops. Archaeological evidence from mining sites reveals the introduction of new extraction technologies and organisational methods that enhance productivity while maintaining employment for local populations, whose specialised skills remained essential for continued operations. Integration of Thuringian commercial networks into broader Frankish trading systems created new opportunities for economic development, while ensuring that commercial activities contributed to royal revenues through systematic taxation. The amber trade routes that had connected Baltic sources with Mediterranean markets through Thuringian territory continued to function under Frankish control, though subject to new regulations and tax requirements that ensured royal participation in commercial profits. Archaeological evidence reveals the establishment of new customs facilities and inspection stations along major trade routes where commercial goods could be assessed and taxed according to standardised procedures that applied throughout Frankish territories. The development of monetary systems within former Thuringian territories reflected the gradual integration of local economies into broader Frankish commercial networks that relied increasingly on standardised coinage for major transactions. The introduction of Frankish silver coins replaced the traditional Germanic practice of payment in kind for many commercial and administrative transactions, creating more efficient systems for tax collection and trade regulation. Archaeological evidence from commercial sites reveals the rapid adoption of Frankish coinage, alongside the continuation of traditional barter systems for local transactions, indicating the gradual transformation of economic practices without complete disruption of established commercial relationships. The establishment of royal workshops and manufacturing centres throughout former Thuringian territories provided employment for skilled craftsmen while ensuring the production of goods required for administrative and military purposes. These facilities produced standardised weapons and equipment for county military forces, ceremonial objects for administrative use, and luxury goods that demonstrated royal wealth and authority. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals the systematic organisation of production activities with specialised areas for different categories of manufacturing and quality control procedures that ensured consistent standards for royal commissions. The transformation of agricultural practices under Frankish administration involved the introduction of new farming techniques and crop varieties that could increase productivity while supporting larger populations and greater tax obligations. Frankish agricultural specialists provided technical assistance and training that helped local farmers adapt to new requirements while maintaining traditional knowledge that had proven effective in local conditions. Archaeological evidence from agricultural sites reveals the gradual adoption of improved ploughing techniques, crop rotation systems, and livestock management practices that enhance productivity while preserving traditional agricultural knowledge that remained valuable for local conditions. The systematic conversion of former Thuringian territories to Christianity accelerated dramatically following their incorporation into the Frankish kingdom, as Merovingian rulers recognised the crucial role that religious transformation played in securing long-term political control over conquered populations. The arrival of Anglo-Saxon missionaries from Britain during the 530s marked the beginning of organised evangelisation efforts that would fundamentally alter the spiritual landscape of central Germany. These missionary expeditions, led by monks trained in the rigorous theological traditions of Canterbury and Lindisfarne, brought sophisticated approaches to conversion that combined theological instruction with practical services that demonstrated the superior power of the Christian God over traditional Germanic deities. The missionary Wigbert, arriving from the monastery of Glastonbury around 534 AD, established the first permanent Christian mission station at Fritzlar, strategically positioned to serve as a base for evangelization efforts throughout the former Thuringian heartland. Archaeological excavations at the Fritzlar site have revealed the construction of a modest wooden church surrounded by residential buildings for missionary personnel and workshops for manuscript copying and religious instruction. The mission complex included specialized facilities for training local converts as catechists and translators, recognizing the crucial importance of indigenous personnel in reaching populations who remained suspicious of foreign religious innovations. The practical approach adopted by Anglo-Saxon missionaries emphasized the demonstration of Christian spiritual power through healing services, agricultural advice, and literacy instruction that provided tangible benefits to potential converts while gradually introducing theological concepts. Wigbert's mission records, preserved in later monastic chronicles, describe systematic efforts to learn local languages and customs that enabled effective communication with Thuringian populations who had previously encountered Christianity only through the limited contacts maintained by the royal court. The establishment of medical facilities at mission stations provided healing services that competed directly with traditional Germanic religious practices, offering alternative explanations for illness and recovery that challenged the authority of pagan priests and traditional spiritual beliefs. The construction of the first monastery at Fulda in 744 AD by the Anglo-Saxon missionary Sturm represented a crucial milestone in the institutional development of Christianity throughout former Thuringian territories. The selection of the Fulda site reflected careful consideration of strategic factors, including accessibility to major population centres, availability of water sources and building materials, and defensibility against potential attacks by hostile populations. Archaeological investigations have revealed the systematic planning that preceded construction, with extensive earthwork preparations and the establishment of workshops for producing building materials and religious artifacts required for monastic operations. The architectural design of Fulda Monastery incorporated both Anglo-Saxon monastic traditions and practical adaptations to local conditions and available materials. The central church, constructed from local sandstone with timber reinforcements, featured a basilica plan with separate areas for monastic choir, lay congregation, and ceremonial functions that could accommodate the diverse religious needs of a mixed population. The surrounding monastic buildings included scriptoriums for manuscript production, workshops for training local craftsmen in Christian artistic traditions, and guest facilities for pilgrims and visiting clergy who contributed to the expanding network of Christian institutions throughout the region. The establishment of monastic schools at Fulda and other religious centres created new opportunities for education and literacy that attracted both noble families seeking advancement for their sons and talented individuals from lower social classes who could benefit from religious training. The curriculum developed at these institutions combined traditional monastic subjects including Latin grammar, biblical studies, and theological instruction with practical skills such as agriculture, medicine, and administrative techniques that prove valuable for both religious and secular careers. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites reveals the systematic organisation of educational facilities with specialised buildings for different categories of instruction and residential areas that could house substantial numbers of students from throughout the region. The missionary activities of St. Boniface, beginning with his arrival in Thuringian territories around 718 AD, represented the most systematic and successful evangelization effort undertaken in central Germany during the early medieval period. Boniface's background as an Anglo-Saxon monk trained at Exeter provided him with sophisticated theological education and practical missionary experience that proved crucial for navigating the complex political and cultural landscape of recently conquered Thuringian territories. His systematic approach to conversion emphasized the establishment of permanent ecclesiastical structures that could maintain Christian influence long after initial missionary contacts had ended. The famous destruction of the sacred oak at Geismar in 723 AD demonstrated Boniface's understanding of the psychological impact required to challenge traditional religious beliefs and establish Christian spiritual authority. The careful planning that preceded this dramatic confrontation included extensive consultation with local converts, who provided detailed information about the religious significance of the site and the likely reactions of different population groups. Archaeological investigations at the Geismar site have revealed evidence of the ancient cult centre, including ritual deposits, ceremonial structures, and burial areas that confirm the sacred character of the location and the significance of its conversion to Christian use. The immediate construction of a Christian chapel from the wood of the destroyed sacred oak provided powerful symbolic evidence of Christian triumph over pagan religious traditions, while demonstrating practical respect for local materials and construction techniques. The architectural design of the Geismar chapel incorporated elements from both Christian liturgical requirements and Germanic building traditions, creating a hybrid structure that facilitated the transition from pagan to Christian worship, while maintaining familiar aesthetic elements that eased the psychological adjustment required for religious conversion. The positioning of the chapel to incorporate existing sacred features of the landscape, including natural springs and ancient burial sites, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the need to maintain spiritual continuity during periods of religious transformation. The establishment of ecclesiastical hierarchies throughout former Thuringian territories required careful coordination with Frankish political authorities, who maintained ultimate control over religious appointments and institutional development. Boniface's appointment as Archbishop of Mainz in 732 AD provided him with the administrative authority necessary to organize systematic evangelization efforts, while ensuring coordination with royal policies regarding religious conversion and institutional development. The creation of subordinate bishoprics at strategic locations throughout the region provided local leadership for Christian communities while maintaining connection to broader ecclesiastical networks that could provide ongoing support and guidance. The syncretic religious practices that emerged during the conversion period reflected the complex negotiation between traditional Germanic spiritual beliefs and Christian theological requirements that characterized religious transformation throughout former Thuringian territories. Archaeological evidence from burial sites during the transition period reveals the gradual modification of traditional funeral practices to incorporate Christian elements while maintaining familiar ritual procedures that provided psychological comfort during periods of spiritual uncertainty. The cemetery at Eschwege demonstrates this religious synthesis, with burials from the mid-8th century containing both Christian crosses and traditional Germanic amulets, suggesting the development of hybrid religious practices that combined elements from both traditions. The adaptation of traditional Germanic seasonal festivals to Christian liturgical celebrations created new forms of religious observance that maintained cultural continuity while redirecting spiritual focus toward Christian theological concepts. The transformation of winter solstice celebrations into Christmas observances preserved many traditional elements, including communal feasting, gift-giving ceremonies, and ritual drinking that had characterized Germanic religious practice, while introducing Christian theological content that gradually displaced pagan religious meanings. Archaeological evidence from Hall sites reveals the continued use of traditional ceremonial spaces for Christian celebrations, with modifications that incorporated Christian symbols and liturgical requirements while maintaining familiar architectural arrangements that facilitated community participation. The development of Christian pilgrimage sites throughout former Thuringian territories provided new opportunities for religious expression that combined traditional Germanic practices of sacred travel with Christian theological concepts of spiritual merit and divine intervention. The shrine established at the site of St. Boniface's martyrdom near Fulda became a major pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout Central Europe, generating substantial revenues for monastic communities while providing opportunities for religious instruction and conversion of populations who might not otherwise encounter systematic Christian teaching. Archaeological investigations at pilgrimage sites reveal the construction of specialized facilities including hostels for pilgrims, workshops for producing religious souvenirs, and ceremonial spaces designed to accommodate large gatherings of visitors during major religious festivals. The integration of traditional Germanic artistic traditions with Christian iconographic requirements created new forms of religious art that facilitated the visual communication of Christian, theological concepts, while maintaining aesthetic elements that remained familiar and appealing to recently converted populations. The illuminated manuscripts produced at Fulda and other monastic centres incorporated traditional Germanic decorative motifs, including interlaced animal designs and geometric patterns into Christian religious contexts, creating hybrid artistic styles that demonstrated the compatibility of local cultural traditions with Christian spiritual requirements. The production of religious artefacts, including crosses, chalices, and reliquaries, provided opportunities for local craftsmen to adapt traditional metalworking techniques to Christian ceremonial requirements while maintaining employment and social status during periods of cultural transformation. The establishment of Christian burial practices throughout former Thuringian territories involved the gradual transformation of traditional Germanic funeral customs rather than their complete replacement, creating new forms of mortuary ritual that combined Christian theological concepts with familiar ceremonial elements that provided psychological comfort for grieving families. The orientation of Christian burials toward the east replaced traditional Germanic burial directions, while maintaining the practice of grave good deposition in modified forms that reflected Christian beliefs about the afterlife and spiritual preparation. Archaeological evidence from Christian cemeteries reveals the systematic organization of burial areas with separate sections for clergy, nobility, and common population that reflected both Christian theological concepts and traditional Germanic social hierarchies. The development of Christian legal traditions within former Thuringian territories required the integration of traditional Germanic legal customs with Christian moral teachings and canonical law requirements that created new frameworks for social organization and dispute resolution. The establishment of ecclesiastical courts provided alternative venues for legal proceedings that emphasized reconciliation and spiritual guidance, rather than traditional Germanic approaches that focused on compensation and social status. The training of Christian clergy in legal procedures enabled them to serve as mediators and advisors in disputes that involved moral or spiritual issues, while maintaining respect for traditional legal customs that did not conflict with Christian theological requirements. The economic transformation accompanying Christianization involved the systematic reorganization of agricultural practices and craft production to support monastic communities and ecclesiastical institutions while maintaining productivity and employment for local populations. The introduction of new agricultural techniques by monastic communities, including improved crop rotation systems and livestock management practices, enhanced productivity while providing practical demonstrations of Christian spiritual benefits that supported conversion efforts. The establishment of monastic workshops for manuscript production, metalworking, and textile manufacture created new employment opportunities while training local craftsmen in techniques that combine traditional skills with Christian artistic requirements. The construction of churches throughout former Thuringian territories required the mobilization of substantial resources and skilled labour that demonstrated both the wealth of Christian institutions and the commitment of converted populations to their new religious obligations. The church at Hersfeld, begun around 769 AD, featured sophisticated stone construction techniques that incorporated both Frankish architectural traditions and local building materials, creating a structure that could serve both liturgical requirements and community assembly needs. The systematic positioning of churches at locations that had previously served as pagan cult sites facilitated the transfer of religious authority, while maintaining spiritual continuity that eased the psychological adjustment required for religious conversion. The development of Christian educational institutions created new opportunities for intellectual development and social advancement that attracted students from throughout Central Europe, while providing trained personnel for ecclesiastical and administrative positions. The school established at Fulda under Abbot Sturm developed sophisticated curricula that combined traditional monastic subjects with practical training in agriculture, medicine, and administrative techniques that proved valuable for both religious and secular careers. The systematic copying of manuscripts at monastic scriptoriums preserved classical and Christian texts, while training scribes and illuminators whose skills contributed to the broader cultural development of the region. The missionary strategies employed by Christian evangelists reflected sophisticated understanding of Germanic cultural psychology and the importance of demonstrating practical benefits that could compete effectively with traditional religious practices. The establishment of medical facilities at mission stations provided healing services that offered alternative explanations for illness and recovery while challenging the authority of traditional religious practitioners. The provision of agricultural advice and technical assistance demonstrated Christian spiritual power through practical improvements that enhance community prosperity while creating positive associations with Christian religious teachings. The transformation of traditional Germanic religious sites into Christian sacred spaces required careful attention to local spiritual traditions and community attachments that could either facilitate or obstruct religious conversion efforts. The conversion of the sacred grove at Büreberg into a Christian monastery preserved the spiritual significance of the location, while redirecting religious focus toward Christian theological concepts and liturgical practices. Archaeological evidence reveals the systematic adaptation of existing ceremonial structures and sacred features to accommodate Christian worship requirements while maintaining familiar elements that provided psychological continuity during periods of religious transformation. The political reorganization that followed Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 AD created new opportunities for the revival of Thuringian territorial identity within the broader framework of Carolingian imperial administration. The systematic restructuring of Frankish administrative units during the early 9th century included the formal re-establishment of Thuringia as a distinct duchy, though one fundamentally different from the independent kingdom that had fallen to Frankish conquest nearly 3 centuries earlier. This new Thuringian duchy encompassed territories that corresponded roughly to the historic Thuringian heartland, extending from the Harz Mountains in the north to the Thuringian forest in the south, while incorporating additional lands along the Saale River that had been gradually settled by populations maintaining Thuringian cultural traditions. The appointment of Frankish nobles to govern the restored duchy reflected Carolingian policies that balanced administrative efficiency with political reliability, ensuring that territorial governors possessed both the military experience necessary to defend frontier regions and the administrative skills required for effective governance of complex multi-ethnic populations. The first Carolingian Duke of Thuringia, appointed around 805 AD, was drawn from the Frankish nobility that had served with distinction in Charlemagne's Saxon campaigns, bringing practical experience in frontier administration and military organisation that proved crucial for managing territories that remained vulnerable to Saxon raiding and Slavic pressure along the eastern borders. The administrative structure established for the Carolingian Duchy incorporated lessons learned from decades of Frankish governance in central Germany, creating hybrid institutions that combine traditional Frankish administrative methods with practical adaptations to local conditions and population characteristics. The ducal court at Erfurt functioned as both a military headquarters and an administrative centre, with specialised facilities for tax collection, judicial proceedings, and military recruitment that could serve the diverse needs of urban merchants, rural farmers, and frontier settlers. The construction of new administrative buildings during this period reveals sophisticated planning that accommodated both ceremonial requirements and practical administrative functions, with great halls designed for public assemblies alongside smaller chambers for confidential governmental business. The integration of existing Thuringian noble families into the Carolingian administrative hierarchy required careful management of competing loyalties and traditional rivalries that had persisted despite centuries of Frankish rule. Families that had successfully navigated the transition from independent kingdom to Frankish county now found new opportunities for advancement within the expanded administrative structure of the duchy, though always under the oversight of appointed Frankish officials who maintained ultimate authority. The archaeological evidence from noble residences during this period reveals the continued prosperity of Thuringian aristocratic families with substantial construction projects and luxury goods that demonstrate their successful adaptation to Carolingian political structures while maintaining distinct cultural identities. The military reorganisation that accompanied the establishment of the Carolingian Duchy transformed Thuringian military service from feudal obligations to systematic participation in imperial campaigns that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of central German territories. Thuringian contingents served in Charlemagne's Italian expeditions, contributing specialised skills in siege warfare and mountain combat that had been developed through generations of frontier conflict with Saxon and Slavic peoples. The standardisation of weapons and equipment required for imperial service led to the establishment of new armories and weapons workshops throughout Thuringian territories, with production centres at Erfurt and Mühlhausen supplying not only local military needs, but also contributing to broader imperial military requirements. The participation of Thuringian forces in Carolingian military campaigns provided opportunities for territorial expansion and the acquisition of wealth that compensated for the loss of political independence, while creating new forms of regional identity based on military achievement and imperial service. Thuringian warriors distinguished themselves in the conquest of Avar territories along the Danube, where their experience in frontier warfare and siege operations proved particularly valuable for reducing fortified positions and establishing permanent Carolingian control over strategic river crossings. The distribution of plunder and territorial grants following these successful campaigns provided substantial rewards for Thuringian military service, while creating new networks of loyalty that bound regional military leaders to imperial authority. The Saxon wars that dominated Charlemagne's military activities for over 3 decades created particular opportunities for Thuringian military commanders who possessed intimate knowledge of Saxon tactical methods and territorial organisation gained through centuries of border conflict. The appointment of Thuringian nobles to command positions in Saxon campaigns reflected imperial recognition of their specialised expertise, while providing opportunities for advancement that had been unavailable under previous Frankish administrative arrangements. Archaeological evidence from military sites along the Saxon frontier reveals the systematic organisation of Thuringian military units, with standardised equipment and coordinated tactical arrangements that enabled effective cooperation with other imperial forces while maintaining distinct regional military traditions. The gradual transition from Frankish to Saxon ducal appointments during the latter half of the 9th century reflected changing imperial priorities and the practical requirements of governing territories that faced increasing pressure from Magyar raids and Slavic expansion along the eastern frontiers. The appointment of Saxon nobles to govern Thuringian territories created new administrative challenges while providing access to military resources and strategic expertise that proved crucial for frontier defence. The first Saxon Duke of Thuringia, appointed around 880 AD, brought extensive experience in eastern frontier warfare along with established relationships with Saxon military commanders who could provide additional support for territorial defence. The administrative methods employed by Saxon ducal appointees differed significantly from previous Frankish approaches, emphasising military efficiency and frontier security over the complex ceremonial and judicial procedures that had characterised earlier Carolingian governance. The simplification of administrative procedures enabled more rapid response to military threats, while reducing the bureaucratic overhead that had sometimes hindered effective governance during periods of crisis. Archaeological evidence from ducal residences during this period reveals the construction of more heavily fortified administrative centres with enhanced defensive capabilities and improved facilities for housing military garrisons that could respond quickly to external threats. The economic development that accompanied the establishment of stable ducal administration created new opportunities for commercial expansion and urban growth that transformed the economic landscape of Thuringian territories. The positioning of major towns along established trade routes connecting northern and southern European markets enabled Thuringian merchants to participate in expanding commercial networks that linked Scandinavian amber sources with Mediterranean luxury goods. The growth of market towns such as Erfurt, Gotha and Eisenach during this period reflects the systematic development of commercial infrastructure that could support increased trade volumes, while generating substantial tax revenues for ducal administration. The construction of new roads and bridges throughout Thuringian territories facilitated both military movement and commercial transport, creating integrated transportation networks that connected previously isolated rural areas with major commercial centres and administrative headquarters. The technical sophistication of these construction projects demonstrates the availability of skilled engineers and substantial labour forces that could undertake major infrastructure development while maintaining agricultural productivity and military preparedness. Archaeological investigations of bridge foundations and road surfaces reveal construction techniques that incorporated both Roman engineering principles and Germanic practical adaptations, creating durable infrastructure that could withstand both heavy commercial traffic and military use during periods of conflict. The development of specialised craft production centres throughout the duchy provided employment for skilled artisans while generating export commodities that contributed to regional prosperity and commercial expansion. The metalworking industries that had sustained Thuringian economic development since the early Germanic period continued to flourish under Carolingian administration, with workshops at Kachla and Ilmenau producing high-quality weapons, tools, and decorative objects that found markets throughout the empire. The integration of traditional Thuringian metallurgical techniques with new technologies and design elements learned through contact with other imperial territories created hybrid production methods that enhanced both quality and productivity while maintaining competitive advantages in specialised markets. The textile production that had characterised Thuringian economic activity since the migration period expanded significantly during the Carolingian period, with workshops producing both utilitarian fabrics for local consumption and luxury textiles for export to distant markets. The development of new dyeing techniques and decorative patterns created distinctive Thuringian textile styles that became sought after throughout the empire, while the systematic organisation of production enabled increased output that could meet growing demand from expanding urban populations. Archaeological evidence from textile production sites reveals the sophisticated organisation of manufacturing processes with specialized facilities for different stages of production and quality control measures that ensured consistent standards for commercial products. The agricultural intensification that supported urban growth and commercial expansion involved the systematic improvement of farming techniques and the expansion of cultivated areas into previously marginal lands. The introduction of new crop varieties and improved agricultural tools enhanced productivity while supporting larger populations and generating greater surplus for commercial activities. The construction of new mills and processing facilities enabled more efficient grain production and food preservation, while improved livestock management practices increased the availability of meat, dairy products, and raw materials for craft production. Archaeological surveys of rural areas reveal the systematic organisation of agricultural estates, with improved field systems and storage facilities that maximise productive capacity while providing secure food supplies during periods of military conflict or commercial disruption. The monastic communities that had been established during the Christianization period continued to play crucial roles in economic development through their systematic approaches to agriculture, craft production, and technological innovation. The monastery at Fulda functioned as both a religious centre and an economic hub, with extensive agricultural holdings that employed advanced farming techniques while supporting workshops that produced manuscripts, metalwork, and other specialised products. The systematic record-keeping maintained by monastic communities provided valuable information about agricultural productivity, population changes, and economic trends that assisted ducal administrators in planning taxation and resource allocation policies. The integration of Thuringian territories into broader Carolingian commercial networks created new opportunities for long-distance trade, while exposing local economies to external market fluctuations and competitive pressures. The amber trade routes that had connected Baltic sources with Mediterranean markets since the Roman period continued to function under Carolingian administration, though subject to new regulations and taxation systems that ensured imperial participation in commercial profits. The establishment of customs facilities and inspection stations along major trade routes enabled systematic collection of commercial taxes while providing security for merchant caravans that transported valuable goods across potentially dangerous frontier territories. The development of monetary systems within Thuringian territories reflected the gradual integration of local economies into broader imperial commercial networks that relied increasingly on standardized coinage for major transactions. The establishment of mints at major commercial centres enabled local production of silver coins that met imperial standards, while incorporating regional designs and symbols that maintained distinct Thuringian identity within the broader imperial monetary system. Archaeological evidence from commercial sites reveals the rapid adoption of Carolingian coinage, alongside the continuation of traditional barter systems for local transactions, indicating the gradual transformation of economic practices without complete disruption of established commercial relationships. The military obligations associated with ducal status required the systematic organisation of Thuringian military resources to provide specified numbers of trained warriors for imperial campaigns, while maintaining adequate forces for local defence and frontier security. The development of professional military units that could serve effectively alongside other imperial forces required standardized training, equipment, and tactical procedures that enabled coordinated operations across diverse terrain and against various enemy types. Archaeological evidence from military installations reveals the systematic organization of training facilities and weapons storage areas that could support the complex logistical requirements of imperial military service while maintaining readiness for local defensive operations. The fortification networks established throughout Thuringian territories during this period created integrated defensive systems that could coordinate resistance against large-scale invasions while providing secure bases for offensive operations and commercial activities. The strategic positioning of fortified positions along major river valleys and mountain passes demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military geography and the importance of controlling key terrain features that could channel enemy movements or provide access to valuable resources. The construction techniques employed in these fortifications incorporated lessons learned from decades of frontier warfare, with defensive designs that could withstand both siege engines and prolonged blockade, while maintaining communication with other defensive positions and supply sources. The cultural synthesis that emerged during the Carolingian period combined traditional Thuringian identity with imperial political structures and Christian religious practices, creating new forms of regional culture that maintained distinct characteristics while participating fully in broader imperial civilization. The preservation of traditional Germanic artistic motifs and decorative styles within Christian religious contexts demonstrated the successful integration of local cultural traditions with imperial religious and political requirements. The production of illuminated manuscripts, religious artifacts, and ceremonial objects that combined Thuringian artistic traditions with Carolingian imperial symbolism created hybrid cultural forms that expressed both local identity and imperial loyalty, while contributing to the broader cultural development of Carolingian civilization. The dissolution of the Carolingian Empire during the 9th and 10th centuries paradoxically strengthened rather than weakened the preservation of Thuringian cultural identity, as the breakdown of centralized imperial authority allowed local traditions to reassert themselves within the emerging framework of the Holy Roman Empire. The fragmentation of political control created spaces where traditional practices, linguistic variations, and cultural memories could persist alongside the newer Christian and imperial institutions that had been imposed during centuries of Frankish rule. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements during this transitional period reveals the remarkable continuity of material culture traditions that had survived multiple political transformations, with pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and burial practices maintaining distinctively Thuringian characteristics despite centuries of external political control. The persistence of traditional Thuringian dialects throughout the medieval period demonstrates the deep-rooted nature of cultural identity that transcended political boundaries and administrative reorganization. Linguistic analysis of place names recorded in medieval documents reveals the systematic preservation of Germanic toponyms that encoded information about landscape features, settlement patterns, and religious practices that predated Christian conversion. The village name Donnersberg preserved memory of Donar worship sites, while settlements with names ending in Leben and Stedt maintained linguistic patterns that reflected traditional Thuringian approaches to territorial organization and community structure. These linguistic survivals provided crucial links to pre-Christian cultural practices that continue to influence community identity long after the formal adoption of Christian religious observances. The archaeological investigation of rural cemeteries from the 10th through 12th centuries reveals the complex negotiation between Christian burial requirements and traditional Germanic mortuary practices that characterize the gradual transformation of Thuringian religious culture. The cemetery at Langensalza contains burials that demonstrate this cultural synthesis, with Christian burial orientations and cross symbols appearing alongside traditional grave goods, including iron knives, ceramic vessels, and personal ornaments that reflected persistent beliefs about afterlife requirements and spiritual preparation. The careful arrangement of family burial plots according to traditional kinship patterns suggests the continuation of clan-based social organization within the framework of Christian parish structures, creating hybrid community institutions that combined Germanic and Christian organizational principles. The preservation of traditional craft production techniques provided another crucial mechanism for maintaining Thuringian cultural identity across political transformations. The metalworking workshops at Suhl continued producing distinctive Thuringian weapon types and decorative objects using techniques that had been developed during the Independent Kingdom period, with master craftsmen passing specialized knowledge through apprenticeship systems that maintained technical traditions alongside cultural memory. The characteristic Thuringian approach to pattern welding and sword manufacture, featuring distinctive herringbone designs created through specific forge welding techniques, remained identifiable in weapons produced centuries after the kingdom's conquest, demonstrating the persistence of technical knowledge that carried cultural significance beyond mere practical application. The textile production traditions that had characterized Thuringian economic activity since the migration period continued to flourish throughout the medieval period, with distinctive weaving patterns and decorative motifs that maintained regional identity while adapting to changing fashion trends and market demands. The characteristic Thuringian approach to wool processing, involving specific techniques for cleaning, carding, and spinning that produced textiles with distinctive texture and durability, remained concentrated in traditional production centres where knowledge was preserved through family workshops and guild organisations. Archaeological analysis of textile remains from medieval contexts reveals the continuation of traditional dyeing techniques using local plant materials that created distinctive colour palettes associated with Thuringian regional identity. The incorporation of traditional Germanic heroic legends into medieval literary traditions provided crucial mechanisms for preserving cultural memory and historical consciousness that transcended the political transformations that had eliminated Thuringian political independence. The Nibelungenlied and related Germanic epic traditions preserved memory of Thuringian royal courts and warrior culture, with specific references to historical figures and events that maintained connection to pre-Christian cultural traditions. The character of Hermanfrid appears in various forms throughout medieval Germanic literature, transformed from historical king into legendary hero, whose exploits embodied traditional Germanic values and cultural ideals that remained relevant for medieval audiences despite centuries of Christian influence and political change. The systematic incorporation of Thuringian historical figures into the broader Germanic legendary cycles demonstrates the cultural significance attached to preserving memory of the Independent Kingdom period. The legendary treatment of Queen Amalaberga, Hermanfrid's Ostrogothic wife, in medieval Romance literature transformed her from historical figure into archetypal Germanic queen whose wisdom, beauty, and tragic fate embodied cultural values associated with feminine honour and royal dignity. These literary transformations preserved essential elements of Thuringian court culture and political organisation, while adapting historical memory to contemporary literary conventions and moral frameworks that made ancient traditions accessible to medieval audiences. The preservation of traditional seasonal festivals and community celebrations provided ongoing opportunities for expressing Thuringian cultural identity within the framework of Christian religious observances. Archaeological evidence from medieval settlement sites reveals the continued use of traditional assembly areas and ceremonial spaces for community gatherings that combined Christian liturgical requirements with customary practices that maintained connection to pre-Christian cultural traditions. The transformation of traditional harvest festivals into Christian celebrations of Michaelmas preserved essential elements of community organisation and cultural expression while redirecting religious focus toward Christian theological concepts and liturgical practices. The maintenance of traditional legal customs and dispute resolution procedures demonstrates the persistence of Germanic institutional frameworks that continued to function alongside Christian canonical law and imperial legal systems. The medieval legal compilation known as the Saxon Spiegel preserves references to traditional Thuringian legal practices, including specific procedures for property disputes, inheritance rights, and community decision-making that reflected customary law traditions dating to the independent kingdom period. These legal survivals provided institutional continuity that maintained community cohesion and cultural identity while adapting to changing political circumstances and religious requirements. The architectural traditions that had characterized Thuringian building practices since the migration period continued to influence construction techniques and aesthetic preferences throughout the medieval period, creating distinctive regional styles that combine traditional Germanic structural principles with Christian liturgical requirements and imperial architectural influences. The characteristic Thuringian approach to timber construction, featuring specific joinery techniques and decorative elements that reflected traditional aesthetic preferences, remained identifiable in both religious and secular buildings constructed centuries after political conquest. The church at Mühlhausen, rebuilt during the 11th century, incorporated traditional Thuringian woodworking techniques alongside Romanesque architectural elements, creating hybrid structures that expressed both Christian religious commitment and regional cultural identity. The preservation of traditional agricultural practices and land management techniques provided crucial continuity in rural communities where the majority of the population maintained direct connection to pre-Christian cultural traditions through daily interaction with landscape features and seasonal cycles that had shaped Thuringian cultural development for centuries. Archaeological surveys of medieval field systems reveal the continuation of traditional farming methods, including specific crop rotation patterns, livestock management practices, and land division systems that reflected customary approaches to resource utilization and community organization. These agricultural traditions maintained cultural knowledge and community structures that provided stability during periods of political upheaval, while preserving practical wisdom that remained valuable for local environmental conditions. The development of pilgrimage sites associated with traditional Thuringian sacred locations demonstrates the successful transformation of pre-Christian religious geography into Christian spiritual landscape while maintaining connection to ancient cultural traditions. The shrine established at the former sacred grove near Mühlhausen became a regional pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout central Germany, generating revenues for local communities while providing opportunities for cultural exchange and identity expression. Archaeological investigations at pilgrimage sites reveal the systematic adaptation of traditional sacred spaces to accommodate Christian worship requirements while preserving landscape features and spatial arrangements that maintained connection to pre-Christian spiritual traditions. The manuscript production centres established at medieval monasteries throughout former Thuringian territories played crucial roles in preserving both Christian religious texts and secular literary works that maintained connection to traditional Germanic cultural traditions. The scriptorium at Fulda produced copies of both religious works and secular texts, including historical chronicles, legal compilations, and literary works that preserved memory of Thuringian cultural achievements and historical significance. The systematic copying and preservation of these texts ensured the survival of cultural knowledge and historical memory that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political instability and cultural transformation. The artistic traditions that had characterized Thuringian decorative art since the migration period continue to influence medieval artistic production, with traditional motifs and technical approaches appearing in religious artifacts, architectural decoration, and luxury goods produced for both local consumption and distant markets. The characteristic Thuringian approach to animal-style ornamentation, featuring specific stylistic elements and compositional arrangements that reflected traditional aesthetic preferences, remained identifiable in metalwork, manuscript illumination, and architectural sculpture produced throughout the medieval period. These artistic continuities provided visual expressions of cultural identity that maintained connection to historical traditions while adapting to changing religious and political circumstances. The commercial networks that had connected Thuringian territories to broader European markets since the Roman period continued to function throughout the medieval period, with traditional trade routes and commercial relationships that preserved economic connections and cultural exchanges that had sustained Thuringian prosperity for centuries. The amber trade routes that had brought Baltic amber through Thuringian territories to Mediterranean markets continued to operate under medieval political arrangements, with local merchants maintaining specialised knowledge and commercial relationships that reflected traditional approaches to long-distance trade and cultural exchange. These commercial continuities provided economic stability and cultural connections that supported the preservation of regional identity while facilitating adaptation to changing political and religious circumstances. The guild organisations that developed in medieval Thuringian towns provided institutional frameworks for preserving traditional craft knowledge while adapting production techniques to changing market demands and technological innovations. The metalworkers' guilds at Suhl and Schmalkalden maintained traditional apprenticeship systems that preserved specialised knowledge of Thuringian metallurgical techniques while incorporating new technologies and design elements that enhance competitive advantages in expanding markets. These guild structures provided social organisation and cultural continuity that maintained community identity while facilitating economic adaptation and technological development. The integration of traditional Thuringian cultural elements into broader Germanic cultural traditions demonstrates the lasting significance of Thuringian contributions to medieval European civilization. The distinctive approaches to metalworking, textile production, agricultural management, and artistic expression that had characterized Thuringian culture since the migration period continued to influence broader cultural development throughout central Germany and beyond. The technical innovations and aesthetic achievements of Thuringian craftsmen contributed to the development of medieval European material culture, while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics that preserved cultural memory and identity. The historical significance of the Thuringi within the broader context of Germanic tribal migrations extends far beyond their political achievements during the kingdom period to encompass their crucial role in the cultural synthesis that created medieval European civilization. Their strategic position in central Germany made them essential participants in the complex processes of cultural exchange, technological transfer, and political development that transformed post-Roman Europe into the medieval world. The preservation of traditional cultural practices alongside adaptation to Christian religious requirements and imperial political structures demonstrates the sophisticated approaches to cultural change that enabled Germanic peoples to maintain identity while participating in broader civilizational developments. The archaeological legacy of Thuringian culture provides crucial evidence for understanding the processes of cultural transmission and adaptation that characterized the transformation of Germanic Europe during the early medieval period. The material remains recovered from Thuringian sites reveal the sophisticated technological achievements, artistic innovations, and social organizations that contributed to the development of medieval European civilization, while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics that enrich the broader cultural synthesis. The systematic investigation of Thuringian archaeological sites continues to provide new insights into the complex processes of cultural change and continuity that shaped European development during this crucial transitional period. The enduring influence of Thuringian cultural traditions in the regional identity of central Germany demonstrates the persistence of cultural memory and the importance of historical consciousness in maintaining community cohesion across political transformations. The place names, dialect variations, architectural styles, and cultural practices that preserve connection to Thuringian historical traditions continue to provide distinctive regional identity that enriches contemporary German cultural diversity, while maintaining connection to ancient Germanic cultural achievements. The legacy of the Thuringi thus represents not merely a chapter in early medieval political history, but a crucial component of the cultural foundations that continue to shape Central European identity and contribute to the rich tapestry of European civilization.